The signal arrived at the Commander-in-Chief Far East Land Forces headquarters at Phoenix Park, Singapore, at 0400 hours on the 8th of December 1962. It came from the resident at Brunei town, and it was brief to the point of brutality. Armed insurgents of the North Kalimantan National Army had seized the police station at Seria, taken European hostages from the Shell oil installation, and were moving on the Sultan's palace. The resident believed the rebellion was coordinated across the protectorate. He requested immediate military intervention. The signal was decrypted, retransmitted to the Ministry of Defence main building in Whitehall, and placed on the desk of the Secretary of State for War, John Profumo, before the morning cabinet briefing. The contingency that activated in response was codenamed Ale, and it had been gathering dust in a War Office filing cabinet since 1961. It nominated the 1st Battalion, 2nd King Edward VII's own Gurkha Rifles, then garrisoned at Slimlines in Singapore, as the lead element of any emergency reinforcement of British Borneo. Within 90 minutes of the Phoenix Park signal, 2 companies of 1st Battalion, 2 Gurkhas, were drawn up on the tarmac at RF Seletar, parading rifle, bayonet, and 100 rounds of 7.62 ball, awaiting Beverley transports of 30 Foul Squadron. They flew into Brunei airfield in conditions the meteorological officer logged as 8 octas cloud and visibility under 1,500 yards. The first aircraft, captained by Flight Lieutenant K.M. Steele, landed under sporadic small arms fire from the perimeter wire. What followed in the next 72 hours has been studied at the Staff College at Camberley ever since. Captain Jeremy Lloyd Williams, commanding B Company, took 8 Land Rovers and a dozen requisitioned civilian lorries, and drove the 70 miles to Seria along a coast road the rebels were known to have mined. He arrived at the Shell compound at twilight, on the 10th of December, killed or captured the entire insurgent force holding the European workers, and freed 48 hostages without a single civilian casualty. The action was reported in the regimental war diary, now held under reference W0305 at the National Archives at Kew, in language so understated it borders on bureaucratic. Resistance encountered at perimeter, resistance reduced, hostages recovered, casualties to own troops, 2 wounded. Whitehall had, in less than a week, intervened in a corner of Southeast Asia that most cabinet ministers could not have located on a map a fortnight earlier. The Joint Intelligence Committee assessment, circulated on the 14th of December, the confidential annex of which is now declassified under the CAB 158 series, was unambiguous in tone. The Brunei Revolt was not a local affair. The TNKU, the rebel organisation, had been trained in Indonesian Kalimantan, equipped with Indonesian small arms, and led by a Sarawak-born nationalist named Azahari, who was at that moment broadcasting from Manila with the open backing of President Sukarno's regime in Jakarta. The committee's conclusion would shape British military commitment in the region for the next 4 years. Indonesia, the largest Muslim nation on earth, possessor of a Soviet-equipped army of 300,000, a navy with Sverdlov-class cruisers donated by Khrushchev, and an air force flying MiG-21 fighters out of Kemayoran, was preparing a campaign of low-intensity warfare against the proposed Federation of Malaysia. The frontier of that campaign would be the 900-mile jungle border, separating Indonesian Kalimantan from British Sarawak and Sabah. The infantry asked to hold that border would, overwhelmingly, be Nepalese. The doctrine the Gurkhas brought to the Borneo frontier in 1963 was not improvised. It had been written, line by costly line, in the rubber estates and primary jungle of the Malayan Peninsula across 12 years of counterinsurgency against the Malayan National Liberation Army. The emergency had been declared on the 18th of June, 1948, after the murder of 3 British planters at Sungai Siput in Perak. It was lifted, formally, on the 31st of July, 1960. In between those 2 dates, the 8 battalions of the Brigade of Gurkhas had killed or captured more communist terrorists than any other element of the security forces, and they had done it by inventing a way of fighting that had no real precedent in British military experience. The orthodoxy of 1948 had been wrong in almost every particular. Initial sweeps through the jungle by company-strength formations, supported by mortars and 3-inch artillery, achieved nothing beyond exhausting the troops and warning the enemy. The MNLA, under Chin Peng, used the deep Ulu as sanctuary and the rubber estates as larder. They moved in sections of 10 or 12, struck at planters and police posts, and dissolved before any conventional response could close with them. The first commander to grasp the implication was Major General Sir Charles Boucher, General Officer commanding Malaya, but the doctrinal revolution properly belongs to a series of Gurkha commanding officers who simply refused to fight the war the way the manuals demanded. By 1951, the standard Gurkha patrol in Malaya was a section of 8, sometimes a half section of 4, deployed for 14 days at a stretch on rations carried on the back. The technique, developed by officers including Lieutenant Colonel Walter Walker, then commanding the 6th Gurkha Rifles, was to live in the jungle as the enemy did, move at the enemy's pace, and accept contact only on terms favourable to the patrol. The accompanying intelligence apparatus, run out of Special Branch headquarters at Bluff Road in Kuala Lumpur, fed targeting information directly to battalion operations rooms. The Briggs Plan of 1950, which resettled 500,000 Chinese squatters into defended new villages, severed the MNLA's food supply. The Gurkhas did the killing in the green. The figures bear examination. The 2nd Battalion, 2nd Gurkhas, between 1948 and 1959, accounted for 294 confirmed kills against 18 Gurkha dead in action. The 10th Princess Mary's Own Gurkha Rifles recorded similar ratios. These numbers are drawn from the regimental returns held at the Gurkha Museum at Winchester and cross-referenced against the operational summaries in the Director of Operations files, now in CO 1022 at Q. They are not propaganda figures. They reflect what happens when a soldier raised in the middle hills of Nepal, accustomed from childhood to mountain ground and tropical climate, is given 6 months of jungle warfare training at the Far East Land Forces Training Centre at Kota Tinggi, and then turned loose against an enemy who cannot match him at his own game. What the Gurkhas had perfected by the end of the emergency was not simply a set of tactics. It was an attitude towards the jungle itself, where British line battalions tended to regard the Ulu as hostile terrain to be endured. The Gurkha rifleman regarded it as cover, larder and weapon. He moved silently because he had been trained to. He shot accurately because his musketry had been hardened on ranges where ammunition was never spared. When the war on the Indonesian border opened in 1963, the men who walked into it were the inheritors of that 12-year apprenticeship. The personal weapon issued to a Gurkha rifleman crossing the start line into primary jungle in 1964 was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, the British inch-pattern derivative of the Belgian FN FAL. It weighed 9 pounds and 8 ounces unloaded, fired the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge from a 20-round box magazine, and was sighted to 600 yards. In the close country of the Sarawak border that range was a fiction, engagements in primary Ulu were almost invariably under 30 yards, often under 10, and the SLR's virtue at that distance was not its accuracy but the brutal stopping power of its full-calibre round. A single hit anywhere in the torso ended the matter. Battalion armourers working from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers workshop at Sungai Petani modified individual weapons by shortening the foresight protector and lightening the trigger pull to 4 pounds. These modifications appear in the 2nd Battalion, 7th Gurkha Rifles Armourers log for the Borneo tour, an item now held in the regimental archive at the Gurkha Museum. The section weapon was the L4A4 Bren, the 7.62 conversion of the venerable Czech-designed light machine gun that had served the British infantry since 1938. It fed from 30-round curved magazines, weighed 19 pounds with a full magazine fitted, and in the hands of a trained number 1, delivered 500 rounds per minute cyclic, with a beaten zone, tight enough to suppress a track junction at 200 yards. The Gurkhas preferred the Bren to the belt-fed general-purpose machine gun then entering service, on the grounds that the magazine system was quieter to reload in close contact and less prone to stoppages in the wet. A handful of patrols carried the American 5.56mm Armalite AR-15, acquired through Australian SAS contacts and used unofficially for point work. The Director of Infantry at the War Office never formally approved the weapon, but it appears in patrol photographs taken near the Bemban River in 1965. Then there was the kukri, the standard service pattern manufactured at the Burger forges in Nepal and issued through the regimental quartermasters, measured 14 inches overall with a 10.5-inch curved blade of high-carbon steel. It was carried in a leather-faced wooden scabbard on the left hip. The notion that the Gurkha drew his kukri folklore rather than standing order, but its operational use in Borneos is documented in citations now held at the National Archives, including the recommendation for the military medal awarded to Lance Corporal Rambahadur Limbu of the 2nd Battalion 10th Gurkha Rifles, whose action at Bau in November 1965 included the close-quarters killing of an Indonesian sentry with the blade. The patrol load is what defined the campaign. A rifleman crossing the wire for a 10-day patrol carried his SLR, 200 rounds of 7.62 on the man, 2 No. 36 grenades, 2 smoke grenades, a machete, the kukri, a poncho, a hammock, a water bottle of 1 pint, sterilizing tablets, ration packs of the general service pattern, broken down to save weight, antimalarials of the Paludrine series, salt tablets, foot powder, signalling mirror, and a 48-hour reserve of Compo biscuits in a sealed tin. The Bergen weighed 60 pounds. Boots were the directly moulded sole pattern of the 1958 equipment, lined with a single pair of cotton socks. Trousers and shirt were olive green jungle pattern cotton, washed of starch before deployment so they would not rustle. Faces were cam-creamed with a stick of black and green issued from regimental stores. The rifleman stepping off into the Ulu carried his life on his back and nothing else. Major General Walter Walker took command of British Forces Borneo on the 19th of December 1962, 11 days. After the first Gurkha companies had landed at Brunei Airfield, he flew in from his previous appointment as Major General Brigade of Gurkhas, a posting that had given him intimate knowledge of every battalion he was about to commit. Walker was 50 years old, lean, abstemious, fluent in Gurkhali, and possessed of a temper that subordinates remembered for the rest of their careers. He set up his headquarters in a former Royal Dutch shell bungalow at Labuan, on the island of the same name in Brunei Bay, and within a week had drafted what became known throughout the command as Walker's 3 rules, sometimes recorded as the 6 ingredients of success, but most often distilled in the battalion mess down to 3. The first rule was unified operations. Walker insisted, against the initial preferences of both Whitehall and the Commander-in-Chief Far East, that all military, police, and civil intelligence functions in Borneo answer to a single director, namely himself. He secured the agreement of the High Commissioner, Sir Geoffroy Tory, and the Sultan of Brunei in a meeting at Labuan on the 2nd of January, 1963. The arrangement was confirmed by signal from the Chief of the Defence Staff, Lord Mountbatten, on the 18th of January. The signal, now in the Def A11 series at Kew, runs to 4 lines and grants Walker authority over all operational matters within the Borneo theatre. No subsequent British counterinsurgency campaign of the 20th century enjoyed comparable unity of command. The second rule was timely and accurate intelligence. Walker established a joint intelligence cell at Labuan, integrating special branch detectives from Sarawak and Sabah, military intelligence officers from the Intelligence Corps, Royal Marines from 3 Commando Brigade, and civilian district officers who knew the Longhouses by name. The cell was tied directly to the radio intercept station at the Government Wireless Service compound at Cebu, which monitored Indonesian Army traffic across the border on the high frequencies between 4 and 12 MHz. The product of that cell was distributed daily by signal to battalion operations rooms in a digest known as the Borneo Bulletin, of which incomplete runs survive in the Imperial War Museum's documents collection. The third rule, and the one that mattered most to the rifleman, was the domination of the jungle. Walker would not permit the border to be held by static garrisons. He insisted that every battalion area be patrolled, day and night, by sections and platoons living in the Ulu, and that no Indonesian incursion be allowed to reach a longhouse or Iban Kampong unopposed. The frontier he was talking about ran 971 miles, from Tanjung Datu on the South China Sea in the west to Tawau near the Celebes Sea in the east. It crossed mountain ranges over 8,000 feet, primary jungle of triple canopy, secondary growth, swamp, and the headwaters of rivers that ran red with iron. There were no roads across most of it. There were footpaths that the Iban used, and the Indonesian Army used, and the Gurkhas would learn to use. To hold that frontier, Walker was given, at the height of the campaign, 13 infantry battalions. 5 of those, almost without exception, were Gurkha. The battalions rotated through 5-month tours, the maximum the medical authorities, at the Cameron Highlands Research Station, considered tolerable for sustained jungle operations. Each battalion was assigned a sector. Each sector was patrolled. The Indonesian Army, when it crossed, met not garrisons but ambushes set by men who had been waiting for them. The decision to authorise cross-border operations was taken in a meeting at the Ministry of Defence on the 28th of April, 1964. Present were the Secretary of State for Defence, Peter Thornycroft, the Chief of the Defence Staff, the Chief of the General Staff, Sir Richard Hull, and a representative of the Foreign Office. The minutes, declassified under the 30-year rule, and now held at Kew under reference Def A 25, record that authority was granted for limited operations across the Sarawak Kalimantan frontier to a maximum depth of 3,000 yards. The codename allocated was Claret. The conditions attached were severe. No operation was to be acknowledged. No casualty was to be to a hospital where the cause might be questioned. No prisoner was to be taken. No weapon, document, or item of equipment of British origin was to be left on the wrong side of the wire, was to be left. The constraints flowed from a political calculation made in the Cabinet Office. Sukarno had not declared war. The campaign he was waging was officially described in Jakarta as confrontasi, a posture short of open hostilities, and the British government wished to keep it that way. Public knowledge that British and Gurkha troops were operating inside Indonesian territory would have provided Sukarno with the casus belli he needed to escalate. It would also have placed the United States, then deeply engaged in the early stages of its own commitment in Vietnam, in a position of acute embarrassment. The 30 years of denial that followed were not bureaucratic timidity. They were a deliberate condition of the operation's existence. The men selected for the first Claret patrols came from the Special Air Service squadrons rotated through Borneo from Hereford, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, the New Zealand Special Air Service, and from Gurkha rifle companies whose commanding officers had been individually briefed by Walker. The patrols were small, typically as few as 4. They moved at the standard jungle pace of 1 kilometre per hour in primary forest. No identifying documents, no regimental insignia, no letters from home. The boots they wore were issued for the operation only, a bonmad, burned on return. Montai Sol. One to Tom, the targets were specific. Indonesian Army camps at Nantakor, Babang and Sentus. River traffic on the Sungai Bemban, the track junctions through which TNI battalions moved up to the frontier from their staging areas at Pontianak and Long Bawan. The technique was ambush. A Gurkha platoon would lie up on a riverbank or a track for 48 hours, sometimes 72, in absolute silence, and then engage a passing Indonesian column at point-blank range with concentrated SLR and Bren fire. The action lasted seconds. The withdrawal was immediate and rehearsed, often along a different route from the approach, with a second ambush sighted to catch any pursuing force. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, operating in the bow sector under Lieutenant Colonel Clements, conducted the most cited Claret action of the campaign on the 17th of November 1965. A company-strength force crossed the border, ambushed an Indonesian battalion movement on the Sungai Coemba, killed an estimated 32 soldiers in the opening burst, and recrossed the wire at first light without loss. The action is described, in elliptical language, in the 2nd Gurkhas Regimental History compiled by Lieutenant Colonel J. N. Mackay. By 1966, the cumulative effect of these operations was that Indonesian battalions on the frontier were refusing to deploy beyond their fortified camps. The TNI's offensive capacity had been broken not by attrition, but by terror. The base at Plaman Mapu sat on a spur of high ground in the 1st Division of Sarawaks, 6 miles from the Indonesian frontier and approximately 15 miles southwest of the Ibon Kampong of Serian. It was not a Gurkha position. On the night of the 27th of April, 1965, it was held by B Company of the 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, under the command of Major John Fleming. The company had been in Borneo for 3 months. The base perimeter was a roughly oval earthwork, dug into the laterite, surrounded by 2 belts of barbed wire and a ditch sown with punji stakes and trip-flare claymores. The garrison numbered just 34 men that night. 2 platoons were out on patrol. The 3rd was sleeping under canvas, less the duty sentries on the 4 pickets. The assault came at 0500 hours. It was delivered by a force later assessed by intelligence at between 150 and 200 Indonesian regulars, drawn from the 601st Raider Battalion of the Commando Pasukan Gerak Cepat, the elite parachute commandos of the TNI Air Force. They had crossed the wire 2 nights earlier, lain up within 400 yards of the perimeter, and rushed the southern picket behind a barrage of 60mm mortar fire and rifle grenades. Their first sentry to open fire was Lance Corporal Bogan, who was killed at his Bren within 90 seconds. The Indonesians breached the inner wire and entered the company position. What followed was 20 minutes of bayonet range, fighting in the dark, directed by Company Sergeant Major John Williams, who recovered the situation with a counter-attack mounted from the cookhouse with a scratch force of cooks, signallers and the second-in-command's batman. The Indonesians withdrew at first light, leaving an estimated 30 dead in and around the perimeter. B Company had 2 killed and 8 wounded. Plaman Mapu mattered out of all proportion to its size. It was the largest set-piece assault the Indonesians attempted on a Commonwealth base during the entire confrontation, and it failed. The lesson Walker drew, and circulated within 48 hours by signal to every battalion in the theatre, was that static positions invited destruction unless dominated by aggressive patrolling beyond the wire. The signal, copied to the Director of Military Operations at the War Office, and now held at Kew, instructed battalion commanders to ensure that no enemy concentration could form within mortar range of any base, without being detected and engaged in the deep jungle. The Gurkha response was characteristic. The 2nd Battalion, 10th Princess Mary's Own Gurkha Rifles, holding the adjacent sector, increased its patrol density from 4 standing patrols to 7, lengthened patrol duration from 10 days to 14, and began deliberate dawn ambushes on the tracks the Indonesians were known to use as approach routes. Within 3 weeks of Plaman Mapu, the 10th had killed 11 TNI regulars in 3 separate contacts on the Sungai Sekayan watershed without loss. The Indonesian raider battalions, which had begun the year willing to attempt company-strength incursions, by midsummer were operating in sections of 6 and avoiding contact wherever possible. The action at Bau on the 21st of November 1965, in which Lance Corporal Ram Bahadur Limbu won the Victoria Cross of Borneo, belongs to the same period. Limbu's citation, gazetted on the 22nd of April 1966, describes his action in clearing 2 Indonesian heavy machine gun positions at close quarters under sustained fire, and his recovery of 2 wounded comrades across open ground. He was the only Gurkha of the confrontation to receive the supreme decoration. He was 25. The intelligence picture, circulated to the Defence and Overseas Policy Committee on the 3rd of February 1965, was sobering reading. The assessment, prepared by the Joint Intelligence Committee and held under reference Cab 158 at the National Archives, set out the scale of Soviet military assistance to the Republic of Indonesia in unsentimental terms. Between 1960 and 1965, Moscow had transferred to Jakarta military equipment with a notional value of approximately $1 billion United States dollars at contemporary prices. Indonesia was, by the middle of the decade, the largest recipient of Soviet arms outside the Warsaw Pact and the People's Republic of China. The hardware was formidable. The Indonesian Air Force, the Angkatan Udara Republik Indonesia, operated some 20 Mikoyan Guri MiG-21 fishbed interceptors based at Kemayoran and Iswahyudi, capable of Mach 2 and armed with the K-13 Atoll air-to-air missile, a reverse-engineered AIM-9 Sidewinder. They were supported by approximately 50 MiG-19s and a further 100 at the Defence Operations and 17s. More worrying to the planners at the Defence Operations Centre in Whitehall was the bomber force. Indonesia possessed 25 Tupolev Tu-16 Badger medium bombers, the same airframe that carried Soviet nuclear weapons, with an unrefueled radius of action of approximately 1,500 nautical miles. From their base at Madiun in eastern Java, Tu-16s could reach Singapore, Darwin, and the Royal Australian Air Force Base at Butterworth in northern Malaya. 6 of these aircraft were configured to carry the AS-1 Kennel anti-shipping missile, a weapon designed for use against carrier task groups. The Indonesian Navy, the Angkatan Laut Republik Indonesia, operated a Sverdlov-class light cruiser, the KRI Irian, transferred from the Soviet Pacific Fleet in 1962. She displaced 16,000 tons, mounted 12 6-inch guns, and was supported by 7 Whiskey-class diesel-electric submarines and a flotilla of Komar-class missile boats, armed with the SSN-2 Styx. The Indonesian Army held over 100 T-54 and PT-76 tanks, modern artillery in calibriers up to 122mm, and standard infantry weapons of the Kalashnikov family. Soviet military advisors, numbering several hundred, were resident at Indonesian formation headquarters and training establishments. This was the strategic shadow under which the Borneo campaign was fought. The men patrolling the Ulu in jungle greens were not engaged in a colonial brushfire. They were the forward troops of a Cold War confrontation, in which a Soviet client state was attempting to dismember a Commonwealth federation. The Foreign Office assessment of October 1964, signed off by the permanent Undersecretary Sir Harold Katchia, and now held at Kew under reference F371, observed that the loss of Sarawak and Sabah would establish Indonesian, and by extension Soviet, military presence on the South China Sea. Literal in proximity to the sea lanes, through which the Royal Navy's Far East Fleet, the United States 7th Fleet, and the bulk of Japanese oil imports passed. The geopolitical stakes ran far beyond the longhouses of the border country. what the Gurkha rifleman could not see from the bottom of his foxhole. But what governed every decision taken about him in Whitehall was that the V force at Raref Tengah on Singapore Island, comprising Vulcan B Mark II and Victor B Mark II, bombers of Bomber Command's Far East Detachment, was on 24-hour readiness throughout the campaign with conventional, and, on certain rotations, nuclear weapons. Air Marshal Sir John Grandy's standing instruction was that any Indonesian Tu-16 sortie against a Commonwealth target would be met with a strike on Madiun within 4 hours. The end, when it came, was political rather than military. On the 30th of September 1965, 6 general officers of the Indonesian Army were murdered in Jakarta in a coup attempt subsequently attributed, with varying degrees of certainty by varying authorities, to the Partai Komunis Indonesia. The Army's response, directed by Major General Suharto, was a campaign of suppression that within 6 months had effectively destroyed the PKI as a political force, killed at least 500,000 Indonesian citizens, and stripped 1966 the President, Sukarno, of executive authority. By March, Suk signed the SNU appetite for transferring power to Suharto. The new administration had no appetite for continued confrontation. Quiet diplomatic contacts were opened with Kuala Lumpur through the Thai Foreign Ministry in May. The Bangkok Accord, formally ending confrontation, was signed on the 11th of August, 1966, in the presence of the Thai Foreign Minister, Thanat Koman. The military balance sheet was published, in summary form, in a written answer given to the House of Commons by the Secretary of State for Defence, Dennis Healey, on the 24th of November 1966. Total Commonwealth deaths in action from December 1962 to August 1966 numbered 114. Of these, 43 were Gurkhas. Wounded numbered 181. Indonesian dead were assessed at approximately 2,000, though the true figure, given the secrecy of Claret operations, was almost certainly higher. The confrontation had been, in the assessment of the Field Marshal Lord Carver writing in 1980, one of the most efficient uses of military force in the history of the world. The doctrinal inheritance proved durable. The jungle warfare school at Kota Tinggi, which had refined the techniques of Malaya into the operational handbook of Borneo, became the model for the jungle warfare wing later established at Tutong in Brunei, where the Brigade of Gurkhas continues to train to this day. The pamphlet known formally as Land Operations Volume 3. Part 1, Counter-Revolutionary Operations, issued by the Ministry of 29, and revised through successive editions, drew its substantive content directly from the after-action reports of Borneo battalions, American Special Forces officers, Australian ASASR planners, and New Zealand officers attended courses at Kota Tinggi throughout the late 1960s. The Belgian and French armies sent observers. The South African Defence Force borrowed the patrol structures wholesale for its operations in Southwest Africa. The longer reputation rested on something less easily codified. Captured Indonesian intelligence documents recovered after the campaign, summarised in a Defence Intelligence Staff report of 1967, now held under reference WO208 at Kew, included instructions to TNI battalion commanders, distinguishing between British Line battalions and Gurkha battalions in operational planning. The instruction was that contact with Gurkha forces was to be avoided wherever possible and broken off as soon as it could not. The phrase used in the Bahasa Indonesia original, in translation, was that the Nepalese soldier fights without warning and does not stop. It was not flattery. It was a tactical directive from a defeated enemy. The Brigade of Gurkhas left Borneo in late 1966 and returned to its garrisons at Slimlines, Singapore, and at Sek Kong in the new territories of Hong Kong, where the next phase of its Cold War service would unfold against a different communist neighbour. The men who walked out of the Ulu carried with them the methods that had broken Sukarno's army. Those methods, refined in the rubber estates of Perak and perfected on the headwaters of the Bemban, remain in the British Army's professional memory.